Welcome to the Middle East Institute's webinar on what comes next in Afghanistan, a view from Pakistan. I'm Marvin Weinbaum. I am the chair of our Afghanistan and Pakistan studies group here at the Middle East Institute. The dissolving of the Kabul government in August was interpreted by some as a victory for Pakistan. In this view, Pakistan's bet in abetting the Taliban insurgency is paid off. Pakistan has acquired, with the Taliban's takeover, a friendly regime, one that it believes likely to distance itself from the influence of rival India and be ready to settle old bilateral differences. Others see the post-war Afghanistan as presenting Pakistan with more problems than opportunities. Pakistan has been left with a neighbor experiencing a collapsing economy and a bankrupt financial system, as well as facing a humanitarian crisis that threatens to release a massive Afghan refugee surge. It has also reason to be concerned that its own Afghanistan nesting Taliban may be, together with domestic extremist militant groups in Pakistan, be encouraged to possibly facilitated in waging insurgency against the Pakistani state. Additionally, Pakistan is being pressed by the United States to cooperate more fully against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State Khorasan at a time when some quarters in Washington holding Pakistan responsible for failed US efforts in Afghanistan are calling for sanctions. The Middle East Institute is pleased to have Moeed Yusuf join us to share his views on where he sees developments in Afghanistan headed and what they may hold in store for Pakistan. Certainly no country, it could be said, has more at stake than Pakistan and what may happen in Afghanistan. Dr. Yusuf, as a ranking government official, but also scholar of the region, is well qualified to provide us with a view from Pakistan. He currently serves as the National Security Advisor to Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. Prior to joining the government, Dr. Yusuf was Associate Vice President for Asia at the US Institute of Peace. It was during his many years at USIP that many of us came to know Moeed. He was also previously a fellow at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and concurrently a research fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He's the author and editor of multiple books. Latest book, Brokering Peace in Nuclear Environments, U.S. Crisis Management in South Asia, was released by Stanford University Press in May of 2018. We will plan to have ample time for audience questions. Feel free to pose a question at any time during the panel. I will try to get to as many as possible. Submit a question by using Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, also events@mei.edu. Moeed, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for the invitation. It's always good to be seeing you, and I'm sure a number of other friends who I can't see but are online. I promised you I'll be brief, so I'm not going to sort of sit here and give you a long introductory speech. I'm just going to lay out where we stand as Pakistan, where I think we are, and then perhaps open it up for a Q&A or a conversation. So let me just begin by saying that, you started off not surprisingly or expectedly, provocatively talking about what Washington is saying about Pakistan. I'm not surprised either, because this mistrust has been there for the past, 20 years. But if we start talking about the past, I'm afraid we're going to have to agree to disagree and not get too far. So what I'm hoping to do is really focus on where to go from here. But I'm happy to answer any questions about the past as well. But the starting point, Marvin, would be that I think, in my view, for 2 decades, the US and Pakistan essentially were trying to figure out how to end the war in Afghanistan. We had different approaches, and those different approaches, I think, lay at the heart of the mistrust or the kind of conversations that are taking place now. Pakistan for 20 years kept talking about the futility of trying to get to a military victory and advocated a political settlement right from the get-go. If you remember, even in the Bonn process, the argument was that reconcilable elements should be included so that the war ends and we move to the next phase. That disagreement never got resolved because by the time we got to Doha and the conversations, timelines had been set, withdrawal dates had been given and then removed. But really, when maximum number of troops were there, the political settlement really never became the mainstay. So we had different approaches, and that's, I think, where the strategic interests stopped converging. Today, I want to start by saying that Pakistan's interest in political settlement essentially would have been fulfilled by a successful Doha process. Because if the Doha process went as imagined, you would have ended up with an inclusive government. The Taliban would have been part of it. All other Afghan factions of note would have been part of it. And from our perspective, having seen Afghanistan for centuries, unless you have some kind of inclusivity, and inclusivity really in the Afghan context means ethnic groups, included with a decentralized system of governance, you know this better than me, of course, chances are you won't have a stable government. And so if the Doha process had reached its logical conclusion, we would have come close to that, was Pakistan's interpretation. Now, the Doha process, I want to be clear, Pakistan facilitated, the US has acknowledged that, the world has acknowledged that, but we were never in the room. We didn't have a say in what agreement was made between the US and Taliban. We did not have a say on what the conversations were taking place. And the reason the Doha process ultimately failed, frankly, was that Ashraf Ghani decided to up and leave and the army didn't fight. So once the Taliban got a walkover, the process, there was no negotiation to be done. But before that, Pakistan till the last day, along with the US, kept pushing for the Doha process to succeed. So when I hear people say, well, this is Pakistan's victory, this is what Pakistan wanted, I think I've got to be mad to be wanting to get to an equation where I've got a neighbor that has no money to run the country, no real experience to govern, and am left with a border of 1,600 miles that for 4 decades has cost me millions of refugees, a terrorism problem, internally displaced people, and just since 9/11, over 80,000 casualties. So, this idea that this is what Pakistan would have hoped for is irrational. It doesn't make any sense. But now that we are where we are, what is Pakistan saying? Because what I also hear now people say is, oh, you're basically lobbying for the Taliban. Pakistan is saying we want an inclusive government. Pakistan is saying we want to make sure the rights of all Afghans are protected. And Pakistan is saying there should be no terrorism from Afghan soil. This is identical to what the US and others in the world are saying. But there is one basic difference. We are again talking of a different approach to what the US and some others in the West are taking. What we are saying is engage with the new political reality immediately and constructively. Number one, for humanitarian assistance. Because if there is no humanitarian assistance, winter is around the corner, who's going to suffer? the average Afghan woman and man who we all profess to be wanting to protect. So number one, humanitarian assistance is being pledged. There is no mechanism to send the money. There are no banking channels. There are sanctions that are applied. Number two, we are saying, if we want to get to inclusive government, no terrorism, etc., then let us engage with the new reality, incentivize that. What do the Taliban want? They want money and legitimacy, essentially. Who can provide that? Not Pakistan. It's the international community, US, UK, China, Europe, Russia. So engage, and using those carrots, then get to where we want to get to in terms of moderate governance, in terms of making sure all Afghans have the rights that we're talking about, there's no terrorism, etc. What we see the world do is wait and see. And the problem here is that wait and see, essentially, from Pakistan's perspective, is tantamount to abandonment. Because if there is no assistance going into Afghanistan, even if Ashraf Ghani was president today and you told them the US will pay you no money for 2 months, no assistance, he would have collapsed. And it's the same with any government in Afghanistan right now. Ultimately, in trying to hurt the Taliban, are we going to end up hurting the 30, 35, 40 million Afghans is the basic question we need to answer. Now, if we do a wait and see, and if you agree that yes, that ultimately means abandonment, then let's recall what happened in the 90s and what all of us said we will never do as the international community, which is abandonment brought civil war, an economic collapse, a governance collapse, and ultimately 9/11. So how are we now reaching a point where we are again wanting to repeat the mistakes of the past for whatever reason, be it political expediency, be it other very sort of logical reasons to do that. But that's really what the end point is going to be in terms of a abandonment strategy. Now, the conversation then goes back to, well, but again, this is, you're talking for the Taliban. So let me just explain why I'm saying this, and I'm personally very vocal about it as Pakistan essentially. The reason I'm saying this, Marvin, is for the US, 10,000 miles away, it may be a luxury. Potentially, the US can make a calculation. I think it will be flawed, that there is no real threat to the homeland or US interests. Afghanistan, good luck. They can do what they want. But for Pakistan, it is impossible to disengage. As I said, 1,600-mile porous border for centuries. There will be a refugee crisis. ISKP is there. TTP that has killed thousands of Pakistanis is there. And we will have a real problem of a collapsed Afghanistan on our hand the day after. So as Pakistan's national security advisor, my job is to protect my border and my country. How can I not consider this my right to counsel the world that if you go in this direction, the outcome is going to be identical to what it was 30 years ago. And I am going to hurt before anybody else. And that is why what I'm saying is make sure the humanitarian assistance gets there for the sake of the average Afghan. And then let's figure out how to get to moderate governance, inclusive governance, whatever, by using the ability to provide assistance and promise legitimacy down the road or whatever it may be. But when I say this, I am also saying that this is in the direct self-interest of all major countries, including the US. Because yes, Marvin, I'll be hurt first. But if anybody thinks that ISKP is going to remain confined to Afghanistan, or a mass migration problem is going to remain confined to Afghanistan or Pakistan, that's not what history tells us. It's not going to happen that way. And there's also this question of countries who were there for 20 years. I think there's also something ethical and moral about it. That's the argument we are making. The argument is purely selfish Pakistani national interest. But of course, we have to explain what to do in Afghanistan to protect Pakistan. That's just the compulsion of geography that we live with. So what is Pakistan doing? It's leading regional diplomacy. It's asking the world to coordinate its efforts. We are not going solo to recognize the Taliban like the 90s. We are saying, let's coordinate and decide what we want to do. We can have parley after parley, meeting after meeting, which is happening. But at the end of the day, there is still no mechanism to really get the assistance across that is needed. Humanitarian first, and then capacity building and development, which would create a peaceful or stable country. That opportunity exists. Now, if the decision is, well, no, sorry, no, we're not touching the Taliban, there was a war that ended the way it ended, or whatever the reason may be, then fine. Then Pakistan essentially will use its right to keep counseling the world, but will ultimately have to decide how to manage it, because we are not ready to take any more refugees, more terrorism, more deaths because of a war next door. That's essentially the argument we're making. But again, I repeat, and allow me the liberty as somebody who sort of spent so much time in Washington and understands a bit of it, we shouldn't mask ourselves from the reality that today it may be somebody else's problem, but it was somebody else's problem in 1989, 1990 as well. And 10 years later, it became the entire world's problem. So let's not make that mistake and figure out how to balance our goals with keeping the average Afghan woman and man safe. Otherwise, I'm afraid, the same policies will result in the same kind of outcomes. So let me just stop here. I don't want to go on, but I'm happy to talk about anything your audience wants, past or future.
Thank you, Moe. You just talked a moment ago about wanting to coordinate the policy of the region. It's come to my attention that there was very recently a meeting that was called for regional national security advisors to discuss ways to cooperate on Afghanistan. And then India initiated that call, as I understand it. You declined to participate in that. Can you explain your reasoning? Was it just because it was India's initiative?
Marvin, two things. First of all, a very sort of simple logic. We have about 10 forums going on literally simultaneously. So when I say coordination can't be 5 more forums. So there's one actually mechanical problem here. We are going parley after parley without figuring out how to get things done on the ground. Pakistan is not saying that we should host everything that happens, but we need to coordinate in one place where everybody's there. That's one. Second, with all due respect, this is a forum to throw a spanner in the works. India has only called this forum because Pakistan is working with other countries and India is not on Afghanistan. They are finding it hard even to find a single country to ultimately come together and have this conversation, because nobody really understands what the logic of that is. We got a piece of paper that said, there's a forum on regional security, please show up. That's classroom gossip. So all I'm saying is it was never serious. I think it was just to throw a spanner in the works, and frankly, I have better things to do at this point.
Okay. I wonder if you'd comment on what you're expecting in the way of behavior on the Taliban's part. What is Taliban governance going to look like? And what's likely to be the consequences for the Afghan people, but also for the regional players, of course, including Pakistan?
I don't know, frankly. I mean, this is a question that perhaps they could answer better. What I can tell you is the way I look at it, and this is a personal comment, if they have no recourse to being able to run a country with sufficient resources in terms of a normal governance model, or a normal governance model would require, my guess is you move towards sort of harsher measures to control things. But if you have capacity and resources to ensure that you're providing for the people, then I think you probably have a much greater chance of moving in a direction that everybody wants. I mean, that's what I would conjecture. But the fact of the matter is that we've got to understand that there is a disconnect between what we are trying to get to and what I'm hearing is happening. I think in the Afghan context, in the Afghan reckoning, inclusivity is defined by ethnicity. In the Western conversation, I think right now inclusivity is defined by gender and by specific people who perhaps some would like to see in government. That disconnect has to be removed. It can only be removed with a direct conversation between the countries who have a position on this and the Taliban government. And that's what we are encouraging. You don't need Pakistan for this. Everybody's talking to them directly. So sit down and have real conversations about what kind of inclusivity is realistic in the Afghan context, keeping in mind that they basically won a war on the battlefield, and perhaps will find it difficult to absorb major opponents who were killing them for 20 years or so they think. That's how I would come at it. So I think there is a disconnect on what inclusivity means, what's good enough. From Pakistan's perspective, it's crucial that this understanding, this disconnect is removed, because only when it's removed, the world will move towards some kind of assistance model. And that's critical if Afghanistan has to be peaceful and stable, which is absolutely critical for Pakistan's own stability.
You've put over the years a lot of stock in having negotiations with the Taliban. How would you describe the success of the various interlocutors with Afghanistan? It strikes a lot of people that they negotiated not in good faith, in the sense that they never intended to in any way give on issues of substance. Yet, I believe you continue to think that it's possible to get from them compromises. What would you base that hope on?
For me, it's a compulsion, Marvin. It's not a hope. That's what I said. It may be a luxury with somebody 10,000 miles away, but I have to look after my security. And for me, it's a compulsion that conversation happens. Not testing that proposition, I think, is criminal, frankly, and history won't judge anybody nicely if we do that, because we're really talking about 30, 40 million Afghans at the end of the day, not a few people in government only. The other thing is, I just don't know where we will end up and how this will move forward, but negotiating with an active war on the ground between two adversaries, and now negotiating where I think there are genuine interests in legitimacy and assistance. And I think, if that is true, then there could be a middle ground on what concession one side makes versus what the other side makes. That's what I would say. But not doing it is essentially setting Afghanistan up for a collapse. And I just don't understand how that helps anybody.
When it came to forming a government, Pakistan, along with the international community, did pressure the Taliban to make it really inclusive. As we saw, it really became a division of the spoils as far as the leadership was concerned. And we've ended up with a government that closely resembles in personnel what was there in the 1990s. Does this suggest an inability for all of that the Afghan government now wants to have in the way of recognition and assistance, especially humanitarian assistance? Does this suggest here that they cannot be easily influenced, that they will do pretty much what they intend to do, and they will welcome, as I say, anything that they can get? So really what I'm saying is, what kind of influence do we really have, as you see it, over the Taliban?
For 20 years, Pakistan's been saying we don't have that kind of influence. Today, the world is seeing it. I mean, this has been the history, and it's not only the Taliban. Afghans have a particular way of negotiating. They are hard negotiators. I mean, nobody knows this better than the US now over the past 20 years. This is the reality that one deals with. countries have different cultures, groups have different cultures. At the end of the day, the question is, have we defined inclusivity in a realistic way? And is there that conversation happening to figure out where that middle is, where both sides, or both meaning US and others and the Taliban and China, whatever, can agree? I just don't think enough effort has been made to figure that out. I do think we are struggling in terms of getting humanitarian assistance across. And as that conversation stalls and there is no assistance, I think the incentive to continue having positive conversations and show progress dwindles. And that's my worry. And so that's why I think that conversation should happen. But no, I mean, it's very, very, very difficult to influence. And that's what we've been saying for years and years at the end of the day.
Of course, the argument for inclusivity here is largely about what it suggests about the way in which they will govern, and what kind of, particularly what kind of social and cultural kinds of flexibility they're going to show. And at least in that regard, it does suggest that they have some hard lines here. They've set some hard lines on what they're willing to listen to. I wonder if you could, let me go to some of the questions that have come in, because we're starting to get a number of them, and I'll perhaps come back. One question, and this takes us back to the earlier, your earlier comments on that meeting of national security advisors. Meeting did take place apparently in Tehran. What do you know about that? Is there anything to report about what happened at that meeting?
I mean, there was a foreign ministers meeting, not a NSA's meeting. There was a foreign ministers meeting in Tehran.
Oh, that was a separate meeting from the one that I referred to then. So okay, about the foreign ministers meeting. I'm sorry. Please comment on that.
There was a second meeting. The first one was virtual. This was physical. Iran hosted it. The immediate neighbors were there, and I believe China and Russia, if I'm not wrong. And it was a very positive meeting in the sense that the region again agreed. There was consensus that we need to move forward, find a way to provide assistance as soon as possible, ensure that the average Afghan doesn't suffer, and continue talking to the Taliban about conversations of inclusivity and moderate governance and no terrorism. So it was a positive meeting, and actually a fairly good readout out of that.
Another question raises how serious to U.S.-Pakistan relationship is President Biden's refusal or failure to contact Prime Minister Imran Khan?
Really, I mean, if he wants to call, sure. If he doesn't, that's perfectly fine. I think that we have a positive bilateral dialogue. There are things still to be ironed out. We're trying to figure out how to get back to a real Pakistan-US conversation without an Afghan lens or a China lens or whatever, because that didn't happen for the past 20 years. But there's a conversation, and it's a dialogue, climate, health, counterterrorism, etc. that's happening. Not calling, frankly, Pakistan doesn't lose anything. If anything, it should be the US that should think about it, but I really don't care.
Here in the US, many people took great offense when Prime Minister Imran Khan made his comments shortly after the Taliban takeover, to the effect that now the country had been liberated freed from its chains that it had. This played out very badly, as you can understand, in the United States. I've heard some Pakistanis say, well, this was just for domestic consumption. Is there a sense in Pakistan that this was serious? Because again, the feeling is what it did was it revealed what others had said in the past here about his true feelings about the Taliban, which got him the nickname, of course, of Imran Taliban. What is the feeling in Pakistan is a realization that this was perhaps an error on his part?
I mean, I think, frankly, the public narrative in the US-Pakistan relationship has hurt this relationship more than helped. When these kind of things will happen, I'll quote you about 5 different statements on the US side, which I'll say, well, sorry, very unfair, they hurt me. One, we have to understand the context of things. Second, what he got the nickname on was that he continued to say, talk to them and resolve this politically, you won't win it militarily. And so basically got a nickname for being right, which is fine. But on this issue, he was talking about the education system. It was a seminar where he was inaugurating Pakistan's new core educational curriculum. And what he was talking about was that in Pakistan, a lot of the curriculum still had a colonial hangover. And the Afghans were never colonized in that way, never sort of quote unquote were in the shackles of slavery. It was a comment meant to talk about the curriculum to the youth of a country to say you should own up to your national values, be proud of who you are, and that's the kind of syllabus that we've produced. That's what he was talking about. Other than that, I can tell you, I think about 50 times since 15th August that he has come out and said President Biden was right to withdraw. This was the only option. There wasn't a military solution. Anytime he withdrew, there would be this kind of problem in terms of evacuation. You can look at his interviews. You can look at Pakistan's National Security Committee, which is the highest security decision-making body. The press readout after the fall of Kabul, you can read it. And it says in so many words, we never do this. We never name others. It says in so many words that it affirmed the decision of the US to withdraw as the right one, etc., etc. That's his real view. But if somebody's going to pick one line here or there and, then create a conversation about it, I can give you 10 on the other side. We need to move past this. And really the conversation right now is Afghans are in trouble. There's an imminent humanitarian crisis. We must focus on this and do the right thing rather than just talking about how bad it would be if it occurred.
Well, it is true that the United States seems priority at this point is the evacuation of those people who would feel are in harm's way in Afghanistan. But don't you think the United States has indicated a seriousness in wanting to assist for humanitarian purposes? But the problem has been the mechanism by which this would take place. What kind of thoughts do you have on how best to distribute this? There is a fear, and it could be politically backfire for the United States and other countries as well, if it turns out, and it would not be the first time, certainly for Afghanistan, that aid money went into the pockets of those people who were ruling. So what are your thoughts about that?
3 things on that. First of all, Marvin, evacuation. And I'm not saying this of my own accord, but Afghans have asked us even, blaming us essentially, or sort of, questioning us because we did more to help the evacuation than any other country in the region. I mean, the numbers, thousands, including helping the US, are the only people the world cares about those who were fortunate enough to be engaged with the Western enterprise in Afghanistan. Taken out 100,000 people globally, what about the rest of the 35 million? So I'm not sure that's the definition of harm's way. Harm's way is people are going to die without food and water. I think the fortunate ones have left, or the ones engaged with the Western enterprise have left. But, the unfortunate ones are those who are not going to have the provisions to sustain. And that's what we focused on. As far as seriousness pledges, yes, it's very good. It's positive, the pledge is there. But banking channels are not allowed. There is no mechanism to transfer the money. In kind, the NGOs and INGOs are not on the ground. So how are we going to do this? At the end of the day, that's what really matters. And there, I think, no, enough flexibility is not being shown in terms of relaxing the systems, in terms of allowing the kind of transfer mechanisms that could get there. And we really need to review that. In terms of corruption, dare I say, nothing could be worse than the past 20 years. We have numbers now. We know exactly what happened, which Afghan official is going where and buying what kind of properties. Enough of that evidence is there. So I'm sorry, that just can't be a reason at this point, because the alternative is an imminent collapse, a guaranteed collapse. So, that's probably one thing that we've got to give, sort of think differently about. The crude corruption going into pockets, that wasn't the case in the past when these guys were there. But for the past 20 years, yes, and we lived with that. So at this point, when people are dying, I think the NGOs can manage, UNDPs of the world, INGOs, whatever, World Banks, do it through whatever channel. I mean, that's not for Pakistan to decide, but it has to happen, and it's not happening in enough quantity at the moment.
It is, I think you'd have to agree with me, a question as to whether, even with the best of intentions on the part of the international community, that there won't be enough aid there, certainly in time, to really stave off the kind of concerns that we have, particularly the famine that we anticipate this winter. Necessarily, then, a large part of the population is going to try to find where humanitarian assistance is available. And it's going to look to them like Pakistan is the best bet, that it could be easily distributed in Pakistan and naturally head for the border. What kind of concern do you see here about the possible, as the winter approaches here, the possible crush at the border here as the refugees, desperate as they are, try to cross? This is, it seems to me, going to present real problems for Pakistan in terms of not just the optics of it, but certainly what it can and cannot do. Thoughts on this?
I mean, first of all, it's a fairly callous thought to think about, a scenario in which, well, we won't be able to develop a mechanism, there won't be enough money, so too bad, people are going to die and run away. I think what we really got to focus on is how to prevent that. Management comes next, but the first point is, how do we prevent it? You say that, there won't be enough, okay, we won't be able to create the mechanisms. Well, then the other way is just let them have their transactions, let them have their economy, and let them run the economy like any other country would do, and perhaps money would start flowing. If the international community doesn't have a mechanism to provide humanitarian assistance, let the banking channels function, let them see if their expats give them money, let trade happen. Right now, they can't even trade. So even when they could export something, their fruit is rotting, their produce is basically rotting away because there are no channels to pay money from, right? They can't get any dollars from the market. We're basically crippling them, the average Afghan again, this is not about the government, and just sitting back and saying, well, too bad, it's going to happen. Doesn't make any sense to me, frankly. So I think we really need to focus on the preventive part, just out of pure human concern. Forget about everything else.
Okay, let's assume that they can do a fairly adequate job of providing the provisions that would keep people alive, at least. There's another aspect to this refugee problem, and that is for, particularly in the urban areas, that with the Taliban's coming to power, essentially the economy has collapsed. It was really very much propped up, obviously, so much by the international community, and that kind of assistance is not likely to be available anytime soon. This means that millions of Afghans, and now this isn't just the question of feeding them, millions of Afghans simply have no means to a livelihood. They have no cash. And so whether they want to stay or not, they just simply cannot survive. It's not a question of whether they feel comfortable with the Taliban in power, but whether, in fact, their remaining here is it all in their interest. So as we look at the refugee problem, it seems to me that we're also looking at economic refugees as a large portion of the people who would make up that crush.
I mean, first of all, let me tell you that everybody was evacuated from Afghanistan in the first phase a few weeks back. Frankly, there were many economic refugees in that as well, and those stories are coming out in the media. I'm not, one to decide. But let me say this: the way, what you're framing is correct. I mean, it's logical, but it seems to me that we are really creating a refugee crisis rather than preventing it. Because if the issue is livelihood is not there, they don't have cash, they've got to run the economy. Ashraf Ghani didn't have cash. It was all coming from outside the country. It was a war economy essentially. So let's create an assistance model for them. If we don't trust the government, let's create a model through which we can, in a decentralized way, do something as the international community. The point is there are 40 million Afghans, not 4 million. They can't leave the country. Overwhelming majority is always going to be there. And so, if we are saying humanitarian assistance won't work, they don't have an economy, it's collapsed because the international assistance has stopped. So let's find a way to create that economic assistance model again, give them institutional capacity, and see if they deliver for their people, and also in terms of what the international concerns are. But not going there is essentially creating a refugee crisis, is essentially creating a collapse. For 40 million people, we must have lost all sense of sensitivity, and I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. Again, I keep telling you, for me, this is an existential problem as Pakistan. I'm talking in my selfish national interest, but I'm also speaking for a neighbor who's sitting there with 35 million people, and we need to find a way to ensure that those people don't end up in the misery that seems to be coming if the world just sits back, and watches this unfold.
We have a question here. Isn't Islamic State a group which all neighboring states and the US can agree to help contain in Afghanistan? Are any cooperative mechanisms being devised for this purpose? And what are the impediments?
You see, first of all, terrorist organizations are going to find succor and basically get more resources, get emboldened, and continue to expand their operations in lawlessness. Essentially, in anywhere where you have lawlessness, they're going to find space. That's the 90s Afghanistan, that's the many African countries where this has happened. So the first way to ensure that it doesn't happen is to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't collapse. There is an anarchy. There are not pockets where terrorists can just survive and continue. Many say that in the 90s, that model was built around financing, and Al Qaeda had money, so they could pay off. Well, are we headed in that direction again? Why are we even wanting to test this proposition? So the first way to cooperate is ensure that Afghanistan doesn't collapse. There's no governance failure, and they are in a condition where these terrorists are not going to have the kind of appeal or safe havens that will let them blossom. Then, of course, yes, you need to have counterterrorism mechanisms. There have been conversations, including between the US and Pakistan, but there isn't a mechanism at this point. And frankly, we are a bit confused. Does the US at this point think that Islamic State and these groups are simply not a threat to the US interests and US homeland? And thus, if it's a localized problem, then fine. Because if that's the thinking, we don't agree with that analysis. It is a global threat and a global problem. And if the US and others believe that it's a global threat and problem, then why aren't we immediately helping Afghanistan ensure that it remains somewhat stable and does not get into a governance failure that will give more space to these terrorists? So we are all for cooperation, but frankly, we're a bit confused on this, on why there isn't this clarity that we all need to work together.
It's more than rumored that Pakistan is talking to the Pakistani Taliban, Taliban, Pakistan, and that trying to perhaps wean away some of its leadership, its followers. Can you tell us anything about these negotiations? And considering the fact that in the past, at least, the TTP has been notorious for violating agreements, number of agreements that it made with the Pakistan government. Why, in that context, should they be any more amenable to some kind of accommodation with the state when they are just witnessing what a Islamic insurgency can accomplish?
Well, first of all, I don't think these are comparable. I mean, you have one context in which there was an outsider, a group of outside forces who came together. And for Afghans, if you know their history, and Marvin, you know this better than me, occupation is absolutely not a conversation that can happen. It's a red line. And I think that context was completely missed. I mean, I remember even at USIP, we used to have these debates. For Afghans, even those who would support an invasion, after a while, the outsider becomes the occupier. And that's why, that's one of the big reasons you saw the army didn't fight and the Taliban didn't see the resistance even in the rural areas, etc. So, I don't think you can compare this. I mean, we're talking of a Pakistan and the Pakistani state and law enforcement. As far as the talks are concerned, I think it's been taken out of proportion. There isn't any mega negotiation project as such, but we've always talked. You've said that some deals went sour. We even talked to them before launching major operations in 2013-14, you'd remember, and basically found them not to be amenable. And thus we drew the red line. And thankfully, the result is in front of you. Complete unity of the state was established. Once again, there's been a change in Afghanistan, and we want to see whether better sense will prevail and they will realize that there's a constitution of Pakistan. There is a legal structure within which, if they want to operate, they will actually be better off. And if the answer is they're not interested, then the state will establish its split whichever way it can. I'm not for a second suggesting that we're about to do something drastic. But the point is that all states should talk. And if there are ways to bring your own citizens back into the fold of normal legal structures and bounds and constitutions, we should. And that's exactly what the council was for the US in terms of the Afghan Taliban as well. So I think there's no inconsistency, but it is not at all any decision that we're just going to talk and reach whatever conclusion we can reach, and that'll be the end of it. That's not at all the case at this point.
Would you agree with the proposition that what the regional states, and obviously including Pakistan, want most of all is to contain Islamic insurgency, such as occurred in Afghanistan, to Afghanistan, and that this containment policy really is what more than anything else drives the regional approach to Afghanistan, and that the worst of all possible outcomes would be a destabilized Afghanistan, so that stability is in everybody's interest. Would you see this not only for the region, but for the international community? Or is a weakened Taliban likely to be more hospitable to a kind of inclusive governance? Thoughts?
No, I'm not sure those two are linked. Look, I mean, I don't think Pakistan thinks of this as containing anything. We basically want no terrorism from Afghan soil, and basically do not want any terrorist organizations to be present on Afghan soil. This was our position, even when Ashraf Ghani was president. So at the end of the day, I think the containing game is always a dangerous one. We need to look at ways to neutralize this threat, mainstream those who can be, and those who challenge the writ beyond that have to be dealt with whichever way is possible. I think really we need to think about how to ensure that Afghanistan is truly a country which provides for its people, and because of that, there is no space for terrorist elements. As far as stability is concerned, I think, everybody actually will benefit more from a stable Afghanistan than an unstable one, theoretically. I would actually count out India from that equation, because ultimately India's lens on Afghanistan is to undermine Pakistan, much more than anything to do with Afghanistan. But other than that, I do think theoretically that's true. Now, where those interests ultimately align in terms of practical policy is a different question.
In the past, when the Taliban and the Mujahideen as well in the 90s took power, they demonstrated that whatever influence others had on them, once they had felt comfortable in holding the reins of power, that they, generally speaking, were really not open to any influence at all. But another thought which was related to this, you mentioned India. India would seem to be a natural adversary for the Taliban, particularly given some of the nationalist policies that India has been pursuing. Yet there are some indications that India has made overtures, and that the Afghans, the Taliban Afghan, have been receptive to those. Is there a possibility that we may see a replay of the 90s and that kind of independence here, that once in power, many Afghans and across the board here are always worried about the overbearing influence of Pakistan, and that for them, as much as important the relationship with Pakistan is, you've got to have counterweights. And here you would enlist India along with Iran and perhaps even China as counterweights, so that Pakistan's own leverage over Afghanistan is limited.
Well, I mean, look, it's a sovereign decision for a country to take. Ultimately, it's not Pakistan who determines what alliances somebody has. On India, I'll just tell you, it doesn't make sense. I mean, India's invested money and effort in trying to, go after and kill the Taliban every single way they could while they were in India. But more importantly, undermine Pakistan and through terrorism. We've really put out, and this is one area I'll tell you, Marvin, even on record, where my view has completely changed from the time that I was at USIP. Because the kind of information I now see on what India's strategy, game plan, and tactics is, it's a country on a suicidal path, all right, but my real worry is not that. That's for them to decide. The undermining of Pakistan on a daily basis is beyond doubt. I mean, just, take it from me if you can. So I really don't think that makes sense for anybody sitting in Afghanistan. But as far as control is concerned, or when they're in power, let me just ask you this. How much could the US ultimately control and influence Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani? Every single penny was coming from international donors. And the US being the biggest one, $300 million a day or whatever. Did the US have control? No, right? I mean, that's the argument. So, that's true. That was true even then. We don't even have any money to give to the Taliban. Pakistan is not resourced in a way that, we can do that for the new government. That's why we're talking to the world. If we had the luxury of actually supporting Afghan brothers and sisters ourselves within the bounds of law, we would have, but we don't have that luxury.
We have a question here about Pakistan's view of the kind of factionalism that exists within the Taliban. Do you see this as serious? Is this conceivably likely to destabilize the government itself? That is does this pose a problem for the government going forward? The fact that it has not apparently resolved all of the differences that have existed within the various factions.
My reading is it's been exaggerated. Frankly, I really don't see that becoming a real problem for them. But time will tell. But I just don't pick up any real data to suggest that.
Would you accept the proposition that what might be the real concern of the Taliban in their retaining power is if the economy totally tanks, if the economy totally breaks apart, that would then encourage various factions outside of the Taliban, that is, various elements in the country to take up arms. So is the danger now to Afghanistan really in keeping the state together, to put the economy together?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, if the economy doesn't function, no country will ultimately be able to manage its people well. And so that's why the whole argument that we've got to figure out a way to assist them to run the economy for the sake of the average Afghan, who will otherwise suffer tremendously. That's exactly the point. So if I were them, I'd be worried, just like anybody in that position, I think.
Moeed, our time has run out. Please take the, if you will, the last minute or two for any last thoughts that you have.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I hope your audience found it useful. My only point is, and again, you've known me long enough, so apologies for not being diplomatic on this. I think a lot of talk, a lot of meetings, a lot of debate, very little action to protect that average Afghan woman and man that we all profess to be talking about. So I think we got to move beyond this point, look at action, humanitarian assistance, figure out what's acceptable in terms of inclusivity, and openly have that conversation and see if there is a middle where we can come to. Stop talking about what could be, what should have been, why and how, because ultimately it's taking away from the focus on what we need to do in the future. Let's find out a way to see if we can support Afghanistan, the country, and the people institutionally. There is a political reality we have to deal with, and see if they can get to a point where Afghanistan is peaceful as a semblance of stability, work together on counterterrorism. At this point, I once again, with apologies, can say with a fair bit of confidence, what seems to me sitting here in Pakistan and looking at the equation is that most are playing a wait and see game, waiting to see whether things can get off the ground and then see what support models can be created. Unfortunately, whether it was Ashraf Ghani or the Taliban, if wait and see takes place, which means no money coming in for assistance, Afghanistan has never had the resources to manage things on its own. And so then the result is, basically we set it up to fail. And if so, then are we not worried about terrorism? Are we not worried about a refugee crisis? Partly then my mind goes to say maybe that the countries who are far away think it's not going to be my problem. If that's true, then frankly, we haven't learned a single lesson from the 90s. And that'd be a tragedy, frankly.
Moeed, I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting, this opportunity to talk to our audience. There are a number of questions that we didn't get to, a number of topics, particularly women's rights, which we did not explore here. And I'm sure that you have the same feeling that we do, that the Taliban have to be more forthcoming on this particular issue. So on behalf of the Middle East Institute, we wish you the best in your position, and that you'll do well for Pakistan, but also the United States. So with that, let's sign off, and again thank the audience here for joining you on this afternoon and your late evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Marvin. Thank you very much for doing this. And thank you all for joining.